every good thing has to come to an end.
Hamilton wins the Monaco Grand Prix.
I really was fighting.
Have you heard of the monkey's paw?
What is this thing?
It is a monkey's paw.
It's a story about a struggling family who comes in possession of a monkey's paw that's enchanted with the ability to grant them 3 wishes. Despite being warned about the sinister nature of what they're dealing with, the family would use their first wish to ask for money. Their wish would come true, but at the extent of their son's life. It's a story that's all about being careful what you wish for. Well, how many of you are wishing for this to end?
Lewis Hamilton, the man from Stevenage, champion!
Champion, 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 champion,
Champion of the world!
I know I was. When I started watching Formula 1, I immediately became a Red Bull fan because I'm a big fan of Red Bull and what they do for the action sports community. This was after the Sebastian Vettel days, but it was before Red Bull and Honda really hit their stride. So the occasional Max Verstappen win was really special to me. So for the first few years that I was watching, Mercedes domination was all that I really knew. And all I wanted was to see somebody else win. I had only ever seen Lewis Hamilton be champion. I wanted to see somebody else become champion. Maybe even finally see Max Verstappen become champion and see the prophecy become fulfilled. And oh, how the monkey's paw curled.
I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them.
Max Verstappen, Max Verstappen, Max Verstappen, Max Verstappen, Red Bull domination, Max Verstappen, Max win, Max Verstappen, Max Verstappen, Max Verstappen wins 10 Grand Prix in a row to take the all-time record.
That's 88 missed podiums.
Mercedes-Benz is one of the most historic teams in Formula 1. They've been involved in the sport in some capacity, either as a team owner or a sponsor, since way back in 1954. Just 4 years after the first ever Grand Prix was held at Silverstone. Even before the days of Formula 1 glory, Mercedes were racing way back into the 30s. But despite the Mercedes domination against those pesky auto union guys, Audi. The 30s and 40s saw German brands like Mercedes-Benz take on a little bit of a different role. But anyways, Formula 1. How did we go from unprecedented domination, one of the most successful runs by any team in motorsport history, to reliably in the midfield? And maybe more importantly, is it possible for them to catch back up? Or are they going to be like Williams and try and spend the next 30 years trying to reclaim what they once had? Like I said, Mercedes' history in racing dates way back to the 1930s during the European Championship, a single-seater series where they would win 3 titles. Unfortunately, the series would only last until 1939 because of, again, events. Fast forward a couple of decades and you have the 1954 French Grand Prix, Mercedes' first ever win in Formula 1. After winning in France, Juan Manuel Fangio would win 3 more races that season and would go on to win the Drivers' Championship for that year. He would do it again in 1955, but despite winning 2 titles, everything would change following the 1955 Le Mans disaster, one of the darkest days in racing history. Pierre Levy in his Mercedes 300 SLR would fly into the grandstands at 125 miles an hour after hitting the back of Lance Macklin, killing 83 spectators as well as himself. The crash was so gruesome that Switzerland would actually institute a complete ban on all motorsports for 67 years. It was actually just lifted back in 2022. It also led to the cancellation of the French, German, Spanish, and Swiss Grand Prix that same year. And after the accident, the Mercedes board said what I can only imagine translates to "fuck this" and pulled out of motorsport, including Formula 1, entirely. 1955 was Mercedes' last season, and they were like, we're done. This is too brutal. But during this first period in F1 for Mercedes, the team would win 9 races. Not to mention all those titles they were winning back in the 30s. Point is, Mercedes knows how to race. They would return to Formula 1 almost 30 years later in 1994, but only as an engine supplier by working closely with the British motorsport engineering company Ilmor, who Mercedes would then acquire completely 8 years later in 2002. Working with Ilmor, which would become Mercedes high-performance powertrains in 2005, Mercedes would win 1 constructor's title as well as 3 driver's titles in a partnership with McLaren that would last all the way to 2009. And in 2010, Mercedes would purchase a 75.1% stake in Brawn GP, hot off the tail of winning both titles in 2009. Somehow, with no money and no sponsors, but a double diffuser. Along with this purchase came a sponsor from a small little company called Petronas, and the Brawn team would be completely rebranded as the Mercedes GP Petronas Formula 1 team, and Mercedes would now compete as a Formula 1 constructor for the first time in the brand's history. You guys know the story from here, right? You do, I've talked about it before, well, I'm gonna talk about it again. It's important to understand how Mercedes got so good because it's needed context to understand why it all went wrong later down the road. Mercedes rode through the end of the V8 era from 2010 up until 2013 with moderate success, but as good as Mercedes was in 2012 and especially 2013, they didn't develop the 2013 car at all. The team was focused on something else. They were way too busy planning for what was to come in 2014 with the introduction of the V6 hybrid engines, as well as the massive aerodynamic overhaul that came along with them. They got top talent like Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg. They invested heavily into their facilities and brought in top personnel and devoted all available resources to developing their power unit for 2014. Their goal was just to be able to finish the races in 2014. But they achieved a bit more than that. Mercedes had a unique advantage during this period with their engine department and their aerodynamic department being in close proximity to one another. They were able to create one cohesive package under the same IP instead of having to use a hodgepodge of different parts made by different manufacturers. Looking at you, Red Bull and Renault, they knew that setting off on the right foot for 2014 was going to be crucial for their long-term success, and they worked tirelessly to make sure that they would be ready. Long story short, they weren't really ready, but they just were more ready than everybody else was. There was no touching Mercedes in the power unit department for the first, really, 4 or 5 years of the V6 regulations. This was also during a time before the budget cap, which we'll talk more about later. So Mercedes was able to show up at the start of the season, dominate because of their OP power units, and almost immediately be able to shift focus onto next year's car. This positive feedback loop that they found themselves in, coupled with the fact that they could just dump infinite money on any problems that would show up, made it impossible to catch them. This is the biggest piece to the puzzle for why Mercedes was so dominant for so long. They had a massive engine advantage and they could outdevelop and outspend everybody. They had all the sponsor money, all the prize money, all the top engineering talent, all the facilities. They had Lewis Hamilton. They had it all. They were all alone at the top of a very tall mountain. So where did it all go wrong? How did they go from winning everything there was to win to only winning one race in the past 3 years? Well, it's a complicated question. There's 5 key areas that we're going to talk about here that I think are largely to blame. Those would be their operations, their engine woes, their aerodynamic woes, numerous and significant personnel changes, and the cost cap. We're going to start out with what I think is a symptom of a bigger problem. Because Mercedes had such a big advantage for so long before the new regulations took place, they always had a significant amount of margin for things like pit stops, and they were never under that much pressure to make sure that they had the perfect strategy, that they pitted at the perfect time, that they made the perfect tire choice. You can have 2.5 or 3 second pit stops and it's not going to hurt you when you're 9 seconds up the road, which Lewis and Valtteri always were. They didn't have to be the best at pit stops. They didn't have to make the best strategy calls because they had the pace to be able to hide any potential flaws in the operational aspect of the organization. But when the gap closed up and Mercedes' massive power advantage had gone in 2021 and especially in 2022, which we'll talk more about next, these operational weak points really started to hurt them. Take a look at these DHL rankings for the pit stops for each of the teams, and you'll see that Mercedes, in terms of pit stops, are more akin to Haas than an 8-time title-winning team. When you compare this to a team like McLaren or Red Bull, who consistently outperform every other team in terms of pit stop and strategy choices while also being fast, it isn't a good look. The Formula 1 grid right now is tighter than it's ever been, so you can't afford to lose half a second every time you come into the pits, which Mercedes often does. You have tire choices that, according to Lewis, always seem to be wrong, bad timing, weird strategy calls, and slow, inconsistent pit stops. And when the regulations changed in 2022 with the return to ground effect cars, there were also a number of changes to the power units that came along with them. And this is where it really starts to get bad for the Brackley-based team. One of the changes made for the 2022 season was the introduction of E10 fuels. E10 is a type of fuel that is made up of 10% renewable ethanol. It's what all the Formula 1 teams are now required to run. It might not sound like that big of a change, you're only making 10% of the fuel renewable, but with how sensitive these power units are and how close to the limit they ran, the switch to E10 fuel meant that Mercedes had to make significant changes to their power units for it to be compatible. Going into 22, Mercedes engine director Hywell Thomas explained that the team had to spend just as much time working on the engines to make sure they would be able to run these new fuels as the aerodynamic team did working on the new car's aero designs, which is crazy because the cars changed quite a bit. So how did the switch to new fuel affect them? Well, the good news is that Mercedes power units have been as reliable as ever. The problem is that since the introduction of the new fuel, the power advantage that Mercedes once had to all the other teams is pretty much gone. This can't solely be blamed on the new fuels because Honda had managed to pretty much close up to Mercedes in 2021, but it certainly played a big part. And the development freeze that took place early on in this rule set doesn't make it any easier for them. Mercedes were able to lock in an engine advantage early on in 2014 with the introduction of the V6 hybrids, but this time around they weren't able to replicate that same advantage. And even if they had been able to, it wouldn't matter as much in modern Formula 1 anyways because the regulations from 2014 to 2022 were very engine dependent and the new regulations are not. Even though Red Bull had a better chassis for most of the time that Mercedes were dominating, except for years like 2019 or 2020, neither Red Bull nor anybody else could ever compete with the Mercedes power unit. This is why Red Bull was always so strong at tracks like Monaco, even when their car was being pushed along by baguettes. With that engine advantage now gone, Mercedes is stuck trying to make up time in other areas like aerodynamics, which is another big problem. Like I said, Mercedes didn't always have the best aero and chassis package during the V6 era when they were dominating. They didn't need it, especially at the beginning. Ex-Mercedes engine boss Andy Cowell says this very thing. Don't get me wrong, obviously the aero on a car like the W11 was next level, genius, greatest car ever made. But they only ever had to bring an aero package that was good enough, and their power unit would take care of the rest. So in 2022, when everything changed and Formula One became all about building the most efficient floor with the most compliant suspension, they really started hurting. We were going from one regulation set dominated by engines to another one dominated by aero. And the results that we've seen since 2022 have been what you would expect, knowing that to be the case. Of course, teams like Red Bull and Ferrari and McLaren that have always known how to build a strong chassis are going to be at the front. They've spent the past 10 years trying to make up for an engine deficit with better aerodynamics. But Mercedes were going to have to try something special to remain the dominant force that they had been for so long. And they tried. They really gave it their best shot. The now infamous zero side pod W13, in my opinion one of the prettiest F1 cars ever made, was full of problems. It was one big problem, despite winning a race. When the W13 first hit the track for preseason testing in 2022, expectations were high from everybody. Everybody wanted to know what Mercedes were cooking up, and when people saw that zero side pod design, people got scared. I got scared as a Red Bull fan. It didn't look like anything else on the grid. People saw it and went, Mercedes did it again. But the hype didn't last long because going into the season, Mercedes hit the headlines for all of the wrong reasons. Porpoising, tire temperature issues, drag, brake separation, they got it wrong. But it wasn't as bad as it might seem. Sure, almost immediately it was clear that they weren't going to be in the fight with Red Bull, at least not right away, but they weren't the only ones with problems. Everybody except Red Bull had problems porpoising. Every team seemed to have trouble getting their tires into the operating window and managing tire wear. And it took most of the 2022 season for the Mercedes technical director Mike Elliott and his team to understand and rectify the problem that was causing the porpoising. And although this had been done to some extent, the W13 and Mercedes cars that have followed are still prone to wild fluctuations in performance, as well as struggling to get heat into the tires for qualifying and not always being competitive on low downforce tracks. The problems with their radical concept they went with for 2022 would get better but would never go away completely as development pushed on throughout the season into 2023. It was mostly just full of a lot of experimentation to try and figure out what they were doing. It was clear almost immediately that Mercedes had gone down the wrong path in development with this zero side pod design. And doubling down on that error and sticking with that same concept for 2023 would prove to be regrettable to say the least, as the team would have its first winless season since 2011. But going into this year, 2024, people had hope, because Mercedes had finally decided to commit and ditch this ridiculous design and go with something much more conventional. After 2 years of struggling, they showed up to the grid with a completely overhauled car, one that team principal Toto Wolff insisted would serve as a strong foundation to build and develop from, which the W13 was not. But unfortunately, a lot of the problems that were there for the W13 and the W14 would persist with the W15. At least it looks that way so far. It's still early on in the season. They have cooling issues, tire temperature issues, a lack of high-speed stability, and the rear doesn't like to hook up in low-speed corners. All the same problems that they've had for 2 years now. But there's a bigger problem, one that's really concerning for the team. They can't dial in the setup. And the reason they can't dial in the setup is because when they run their tests and simulations in the wind tunnel or in their CFD, what they're seeing in the simulations and what is happening in the real world, there's no correlation. What they see in their testing isn't what's actually happening. This is a big problem. When you bring an upgrade or when you make a setup change, you expect it to do one thing, but it does something completely different and you don't know why. Well, what do you do with that? In an era of Formula One where the suspension, floor, and aerodynamic components are so intricate and so sensitive, you need to have a good correlation between your simulations and real-world data. But right now, Mercedes doesn't have that. They're having problems that they shouldn't be having, and they're stuck in a goose chase trying to find the causes. But like I said, when you can't trust your equipment and your simulation tools, where do you start? Remember when I was talking about Mike Elliott, the technical director at Mercedes, or Andy Cowell, the ex-engine boss? I think a lot of the problems that Mercedes have been having is from there being so many big changes engineers with the personnel that made the team successful in the first place. Andy Cowell was critical in the development of the V6 back in 2013 and remained a critical component of the team up until his departure in 2020. Mercedes lost James Vowles to Williams. James Allison and Mike Elliott swapped jobs. Dozens of engineers and aerodynamicists left to go to rival teams like Red Bull. Lewis Hamilton is leaving to go to Ferrari. This is a team under tension. They've been stuck in a negative feedback loop since the beginning of 2022, and there's no sign of the ship turning around anytime soon. This is because at a fundamental level, Mercedes just don't seem to know what to do right now. Their simulations don't work, the team itself looks unstable from the outside looking in, there's rumors of Mercedes themselves wanting to pull out of Formula 1 entirely, although I don't know if I buy that personally. Maybe the issue is that Mercedes just can't keep up in the cost cap era. Like I already said, during their dominance, they could just outspend everybody. With the current budget cap of $135 million per team, they can't simply outspend and outdevelop and over-engineer anymore. In 2020, the year that they made the all-conquering W11, they spent $325 million on development. $200 million more than what the current budget cap allows, and that was off the back of an already amazing W10 in 2019. I'm not saying that the sole reason they're doing so bad is because of this budget cap, but you cannot tell me that going from spending that kind of money to spending what they're limited to now doesn't have negative repercussions in the team. They're stuck spending less than a third of what they were doing when they were dominating. That's certainly a factor. 4 years ago, you had the greatest Formula 1 car of all time. It was perfect, and you had one of the greatest drivers of all time behind the wheel with Lewis Hamilton. Everything in the Mercedes organization was in perfect harmony. Then the engine regulations change and you lose your engine advantage because you don't adapt well to the new fuels. Oops. Then you go down the wrong development path entirely by chasing more domination with a radical floor and side pod design instead of just trying to build a stable platform to learn and develop from to begin with. Ugh. You lose key personnel that made the team what it once was. You reshuffle people that are still there. You double down on poor design and concept choices. You have bad operations and bad pit stops that hurt you a lot more now that you don't have the pace to hide them like you used to. You're told you can't outspend your competitors like you used to. You go back to ground zero 3 years into the regulations, which is something that you should have done 6 months in. And now you're having correlation problems between your wind tunnel and real life. You lose Lewis Hamilton. This isn't a video on why Red Bull is so good. I've already made one of those. This isn't a video about why this Mercedes car is so bad. I already made one of those about the W13, and it's pretty much all still the same. I've made plenty of videos praising Mercedes too, so don't at me. This is about how an empire, one of the most dominant forces in racing, has fallen. Mercedes can come back. If there's one team that can come back, it's Mercedes. They can fix their problems, but I don't think we're gonna see it anytime soon. Right now, 2026 is their next big chance. That's when the regulations are being overhauled yet again. That's their opportunity to repeat what they did 10 years ago, and hopefully that's what they're focusing on right now. I want to see a competitive Mercedes. I didn't know how good I had it. I want to see Lewis Hamilton win another race. At least one. All I wanted when I started watching Formula 1 was for somebody else to dominate. I just wanted to see Red Bull win a championship. But this is too much even for me. I guess I should be more careful what I wish for, or else I might see the monkey's paw curl again. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.